Welcome to Adobe Illustrator. Adobe Illustrator is a vector-based program. That means it is resolution independent. So the illustrations and graphics that you create in Illustrator can be scaled up or down without losing quality. When you first open the application, it looks very similar to Photoshop, but don't let that fool you. The applications are very different. All right, today I want to talk about creating a new document, the interface, the Properties panel, and modifying objects using the Properties panel, and Illustrator's Layer panel. Now let's start by creating a new document. So you can do File, New, or Command N, and we're going to go with Print, Letter. And now let's look at some of the options over here. They do look very different from Photoshop because this is a resolution independent application. We do specify the width, either in points, pixels, picas, and so forth. I'm going to go to inches. We can specify a bleed amount. I'll give it a 0.25 bleed all the way around. That's a little bit large, but that's okay for our purposes. I want to be able to see it clearly. By default, print documents in Illustrator are always CMYK. Now, resolution in a vector-based program is determined by the output device. So we don't put in here like 300 pixels per square inch. We don't specify any pixels per square inch for the document itself. Again, the resolution will be determined by the printer, the monitor, the mobile device, and so forth. But we do have raster effects in Illustrator, which have been borrowed from Photoshop. And when those go to print, we have to tell the application how to handle them. So in this case, by default, raster effects are assigned 300 pixels per square. So that's high resolution for the effect. So the resolution, again, only applies to raster effects, not to the document as a whole. And still, you can scale images to which you've applied effects up and down without losing any quality, because that 300 pixels per square inch is not applied to the object until it goes to print. Let's press create, and let's take a look at the interface here for a moment. We do have our toolbar over here on the left side, and we have the Properties panel, Layers panel, and Library all tucked in over here on the right. In Illustrator, in the newest version of Illustrator, the Properties panel has become extremely important. It gives us quick access to many of the most important features in Illustrator. Let's begin by creating a simple rectangle. I'll grab my rectangle tool over here, click in the middle, and if you hold down the Shift key, you will constrain it to a perfect square. And if you hold down the Option key, you will drag out from the point which you clicked. Now that we can modify our rectangle. Over in the Properties panel, I'm going to drag it over here. We have the appearance. So here's the fill and the stroke. So I could click on fill, and that'll open up my swatches, and I can change the fill color. I could click on the swatch for stroke, change the stroke color. I can increase the point size of the stroke right here. If I want other options for stroke, whenever you see a word that's underlined, that means you can click on that word and open up a separate panel for that property. So in this case, I could change the cap, the corner. We're going to go over all of these in time. We could do a dotted line here, for example. I'll make it 6 point instead of 12, make it a little smaller. We can also apply arrowheads, change the profile, and so forth. We'll look at this more a little later. Here we can also change the opacity, and we can add special effects. Whenever you see these three dots like this, if you click on this, this is going to give you access to the full panel. In this case, the full appearance panel. The appearance panel will show you all of the different attributes that have been applied to an object. In this case, we just simply have stroke and fill. But if we started changing things such as opacity, adding effects, all of those things, they would all appear over here in the appearance panel. And because this is vector-based, all of these things are non-destructive, and they can be changed at any time. I could click on here, change the stroke, and so forth. We could change the opacity right here if we wished. And we could add effects, we could delete effects or fills or strokes. One feature of Illustrator that I find particularly fun is you can apply multiple fills and strokes to a single object. So this gives you a wide range of creative possibilities. Let's create another object. I'm going to create an ellipse. I'll click in the middle, hold the option, and change my color. I'll get rid of the dotted line and change the color of my stroke. Something else. I want to create another object. Now with both the polygon or the star, I can hold down the Option key as I start to drag. Then I can release it and I can use my up or down arrow to increase the number of sides to the polygon. Same thing with the star. You can increase the number of points. Okay, so I'm going to go with a triangle here. Change the color. Change the stroke. Yep, something like that. And hold down the Command key and click off of it. All right, now I want to take a look at the Layers panel. So I'm going to go ahead and put the Properties panel back over here, tuck it out of the way, grab the Layers panel, and bring that on out. Layers in Illustrator are more like groups in Photoshop. If you twirl this layer open, you're going to see that every object, in fact, every path, will have its own sublayer. If I were just to say, take my pen tool and just create a simple path like this, and I'll hold down the Command key to deselect it, that path has gone on a separate sublayer in the Layers panel. You just drag it to the trash can to get rid of it. So every object, every path, every closed path, separate sublayer in the Layers panel. Now you should still use layers in Illustrator to organize your document. So you might divide your illustration into different segments and put the different segments on separate layers. You might have your typography on another layer. You might have Photoshop elements on another layer. Keeping it organized on different layers is going to make it much easier to work with your Illustrator files. Illustrator files can become extremely complex. Making selections can be tricky. Let's take a look at how we can make selections. Of course, with the selection tool, you can just simply click on any object and make a selection of it. But many times, Adobe Illustrator illustrations become so complicated that simply clicking on an object isn't really an option. Now I could click and hold down the Command key and click again and move through objects. You can also use the Layers panel to make selections. You see over here in the far right corner, right now there's a little blue square next to the rectangle. That means that one is selected. We click here, now we've got our circle selected, and here is our green triangle selected. I can hold down the Shift key and make multiple selections. They do not have to be in order. So this can be extremely handy. We can change the stacking order, just as in Photoshop. We can then change the opacity over here in the Properties panel, for example. So the rectangle is selected. This is something to pay attention to. I was thinking I was going to be changing the opacity of the ellipse, but in fact I still had the rectangle selected. So even though the ellipse was highlighted in the Layers panel, the rectangle was selected. So let me undo that. Now I've got the ellipse selected, and I'll change the opacity on the ellipse. I'm going to use my selection tool, move this around just so you can see how this works, change the stacking order, so forth. If we want to change the blend mode of an object, that is done in the opacity panel. By the way, here it says opacity. If you go up to Windows, Windows gives you a list of all the different panels you can open up, all the different properties, and you can see there's a lot of them. We don't have one for opacity. What we have is transparency. So that's very confusing. But opacity or transparency is where you will find blend modes, right here. So I could change the blend mode of this one, say, to multiply. And it goes a little bit darker. I'll crank up this opacity a little bit so we can see more obviously. Change the stacking order again. Click on opacity, change the blend mode, maybe a color burn. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't update as I move over them. That would be a very nice feature to have. So you have to actually make the selection and then see what the result is. As with Photoshop, you can click on the eyeball to hide or show a layer. If the eyeball is off, that layer will not print. You can also lock layers right here. Now we don't have as many locking options as in Photoshop, but this will entirely lock that layer. You can't do anything to that layer. It's completely protected. Layers and all of the objects and paths within the layer are assigned colors. Let's say I wanted to move the ellipse to a new layer. Well, first of all, you have to create the layer. So I'll come in here, make a new layer, then I can move the ellipse to that layer. But you see this layer is now assigned red, and now the ellipse is assigned red as well. Let me go to my panel options here and see if I can make this panel larger. You can see it a little bit better. I want you to get used to naming your layers and your objects. To name it, just double click on it and then name each one of these appropriately.